So this week in our sacred gathering, we are continuing kind of our Lenten journey through the book of Lamentations. So we are in chapter 3 this week, and the way this kind of cycle of poems works is using a kind of structure, a way of showing you what is the most important point. That is a very Hebrew way of thinking. It's a very common way of making kind of the most important point in the Bible. It's just a very different cultural way of thinking than we tend to do as Westerners. So as Westerners, we're very used to the logical argument, right? And so when you are making a logical argument, you go kind of this leads to this, which is, we're used to like proofs and arguments back and forth. But for us, most of the time, we're looking for the conclusion, the results of what it is we're thinking. And so we put the most important thing at the very end a lot of the time, right? Now, this is not the way that the Hebrew mind thinks, and they use something called a chiasm. And this chiastic structure does something very different. They put the main point they want to make not at the end, but somewhere in the middle. And the idea is almost a little bit like Russian nesting dolls, right? If the most important thing is that kind of small one at the very center, they have layer after layer where you work your way all the way down to the center, the kernel, the main point. Technically, they call this the kerygma of a chiastic structure. And then after they've kind of worked their way into that main point, they stack all the things back onto it again. So the center is here. You're heading towards something, and then you work your way back out, is the idea. Another image for this could be like the prayer labyrinth, right? In a prayer labyrinth, the idea is to take this slow kind of meandering walk, and you get to the center, and then you spend some time with God, and then you work your way back out again. So this chiastic structure is also what's going on in many people's minds in Lamentations. So a lot of the time, let me see if I can get this. They show it something like this. And so you can see, you get kind of your first point, and then you get B, B1, C1, then D1. So that D1, the D2, when the same point is being made, this is the center, this is the kernel. And then you work your way back out. Again, we get C2, B2, A2. So we revisit some of the same themes we've talked about. And so a lot of people think that this is, in fact, what is going on in this book of Lamentations. It has these kind of various themes that is going to revisit. It is working itself towards an important kind of kernel, an important center, which is the main point the book wants to make. And then it revisits those themes as it works its way back out. So I share all this because in chapter 3, we are at the center point of the book, and I would argue, like many others, that we are now at this kind of kernel of truth. This is the center, this is the heart of the book. And largely in the book of Lamentations, this is the only place we find any kind of hope. It is a very dark book. It is a book that looks very realistically at the pain and suffering in the world, and where is God's place in it. And then yet, in the midst of acknowledging very real pain, we work ourselves to this center point. We work ourselves to this kernel of truth, this kerygma, in which there is some hope, in which there is some trust. So I think that's where we are at this week. And I think just the kind of question I want to be leading our reflection as we listen to this together is, in our spiritual lives, are we supposed to feel God's presence and joy at all times? And have there been times in our spiritual lives when we have had to seek God out even though God felt distance from us and our needs? And so that theme is going to be echoed very strongly in the entire Lamentations chapter 3. I'm just going to read what, again, I think is the very kernel, the center, the most hopeful piece. But on either side of that, we still have people wrestling with this theme of feeling abandoned by God and frustrated with God, and making a choice to work their way into this center point, this place of hope. So, as I'm reading this, let's think for a moment, feel for a moment. Maybe this is even you right now. Of what have those times been like when God felt distant, when we didn't understand what God was doing? What do we do in those times? Are we supposed to feel God's presence? Are we supposed to feel joyful and happy all the time? So keep that in mind. I'm going to be reading from Lamentations, starting verse 20 through 33. Again, hopefully you will read this entire chapter on your own. You can kind of get the better feel here. But like I've done the last few weeks, I will read this kind of slowly twice, and we are listening with our hearts, saying, God, speak to me through this time together. What is it you want me to hear? What images strike me? What is it, you want to teach me in this time? My very life does recall and bends down upon me, and thus I answer to my heart, therefore I yet hope. The Lord's kindness has not ended, for his mercies are not exhausted. They are renewed each morning. Great is your faithfulness. My portion is the Lord, I said, therefore I yet hope for him. Good is the Lord for those who look to him, for the person who seeks him out. Good that he hopes in silence for rescue from the Lord. Good is it for a man that he bear a yoke from his youth. Let him sit alone and be silent. When he has set it upon him, let him put his mouth into the dust. Perhaps there is still hope. Let him offer his cheek to him who strikes him. Let him take his fill of disgrace. For the Lord will not abandon forever. Though he strikes with sorrow, he will show mercy in his great kindness. For he does not afflict on purpose or aggrieve the sons of men. And now I'll read it again. Again, listening for words or phrases, images that jump out at you. My very life does recall and bends down upon me. Thus I answer to my heart, therefore I yet hope. The Lord's kindness has not ended, for his mercies are not exhausted. They are renewed every morning. Great is your faithfulness. My portion is the Lord, I said, therefore I yet hope for him. Good is the Lord for those who look to him, for the person who seeks him out. Good that he hopes in silence for rescue from the Lord. Good is it for a man that he bear a yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone and be silent when he has set it upon him. Let him put his mouth to the dust, perhaps there is still hope. Let him offer his cheek to those who strike him. Let him take his fill of disgrace, for the Lord will not abandon forever. And though he strikes with sorrow, he will show mercy in his great kindness, for he does not afflict on purpose and aggrieve the sons of men. So I think this passage brings up a very kind of important critique of many of the assumptions many of us who have grown up in churches, and that is we tend to look for kind of a happy ending version of this. A lot of the time, the ways we tell our stories, the way we share with people, is this was going on in my life. This was really difficult. This was really hard. I didn't understand. I was making mistakes. My life felt like it was an end, and then I found God. And then I solved this problem, and then I moved on. And we almost always want to tell these stories from this place of victory, right? And in many people's minds, when we look back on that moment, when we first entered the spiritual life, we tend to still have this kind of triumphalist entry, this triumphalist version of the story in which we are supposed to be, joyful and happy and experiencing God's presence all the time. And I think implied in that, a lot of the time is, if that is not my case, if I am depressed, if I feel empty, if I feel frustrated and I don't understand what's going on with God, much of the time we assume that there is something wrong with us. Now, I don't want to say that there are not choices we can make, that there are sins in our lives, that there are just, sheer negligence to the relationship with God that won't have consequences, because there are. But I also don't want us to just default to assuming that when things don't feel right, when I don't feel connected to God, when I am confused and frustrated spiritually, or just normal circumstances in life, that there is a reason that the fault is always my own. And I think that that's a really important point for us to recognize as we mature, because there's a kind of an implied control in that, right? If I can figure out what's wrong and it's probably within me, then I'll fix it and then things get to go back to being better. The book of Lamentations obviously is a rebuke, as are books like Job and other places, of this mentality that God is in the midst of darkness, that God is in the midst of great sorrow, both comforting and healing and connecting with people, even when they are not feeling it. But God also takes some responsibility for these things. God is not totally hands off all the time. And this kind of weird intermeshing, this confusing intermeshing of God's responsibility and our responsibility, and the pain in the world, and the fact that God is not always, fixing it like that, like we would prefer him to, is something that can take us to a place of trust or a place of despair and leaving God. And so I think one of the possibilities, when we feel that God is absent, when we feel that God is not with us, um, is this choice that we see from the author here. Again, I read a pretty hopeful passage. Someone trusting that God is coming, someone trusting that God will do things in the midst of it. And again, I think that the difficulty of the book of Lamentations, that is in fact the key. Even when you are not feeling it, even when it doesn't seem like God is in charge of the world or is going to bring good from this, making the choice, often based on our past experiences with God, saying, yes, God has been there for me in the past. Things that I thought would never be able to work out, relationships that I thought could never could be restored. We go back and look at those things and say, yes, there have been times when when God has brought healing, when God has brought strength, when we move beyond those things. But we also have to admit there are times when we don't actually get those answers, and we don't really understand what the meaning of that was, what was there. And that's when this trust thing, this choosing to trust thing that I think is being exemplified here, is really important. One of my favorite writers, the mystic Saint John of the Cross, from the Middle Ages, wrote a very interesting phrase talking about periods like this. He called this the dark night of the soul. And in his writings, this phrase is one that I think it's just such a great phrase. It's been grabbed onto by many people, and in many writings I've read, I think it's used incorrectly, and that people are just saying anytime things are hard, that you're in this dark night of the soul. In John's writing, as I understand it, the dark night of the soul is in fact something very specifically that God does, and he says the purpose of which is to wean us off of the sweetness of God's presence, the sweetness of just knowing so strongly that God is there. It's, getting us to move beyond those kind of high moments that we talked about, are represented sometimes like at the Transfiguration, right? You see things, God is present, things make sense. Those moments are incredible gifts, and I think God desires to give them. But we also can get addicted to those, right? If everything feels right, we understand at all times what God's perspective on them, if we just know that God is there, where's the trust? If someone never asks something of us we don't understand, do we actually trust them if they're always willing to explain things to us? And at the end of the day, that trust is really important with God, because God believes in us and God believes in the world more than we often do ourselves. And to grow in the appropriate ways, to embrace and hurt and heal with the world the way I think he desires us to, is going to often be more painful, is often going to require more of that trust than we are actually willing to give. And so I think God at times gives us this sense of aridity, of dryness, of these dark nights of the soul, to wean us off of the feelings of control, the feelings of sweetness. I don't believe that God is any further, whether we are plunged into the deepest, darkest, most dismal situations, or whether we know God's presence and his strength and his joy. God is just as close in both of those, but at the end of the day, God is asking us to trust him and his process and his healing, even if we aren't feeling it, even if we don't see the results all the time. And I think that is when we must use our will. That's when we used our minds rather than our hearts to choose to trust God. Say, look, God, you have been with me. You have been with your people, even in dismal situations like they're experiencing in Lamentations. And at this point, I don't feel it. I don't see it. I don't see any possible way out. I will make the choice to, as they say in here, right? I will wait. I'll put my mouth into the dust. I don't have anything to say. When someone is abusing me or doing things wrongly, rather than striking back and using the world's way of solving problems, I'm going to trust you. I don't feel it right now, but I suspect, based on our relationship at this point, based on what others have told me, based on the things I read, that you know what you're doing, that you can bring goodness out of any darkness, no matter how empty and arid and dark nightish it is feeling, right? And so as we are at the center of Lamentations, we find, I think, an incredibly inspiring idea of someone who is suffering immensely. And the Bible is not making light of that. And it is here they find God. They don't find comprehension. They don't find a reason for all these things. And yet they find a God who desires to heal affliction, who desires to walk through this darkness with them. And as we'll see in the next few chapters, who will walk back out with even less of a moment of clarity and less of an understanding what God is up to. But I think this is the key to Lamentations. I think this is the key to Lent and looking forward to the resurrection morning of Easter after the cross, that God walks into those absolute pieces of darkness, even sin and death and the cross, and can bring something out of it. But as we are stumbling through life confused and in the dark, as Jesus hung on that cross, there is a choice to trust, even though there is no evidence, there's no feeling that shows we should. We choose to trust because we know that is the kind of person God is, that is the kind of work God does. And so it can be scary, it can be difficult, and we can need help from God Himself and the Holy Spirit at times to do that. But this is a part of the equation, one we don't talk about a lot of the time. But this is part of what we signed up for when we began this crazy journey, this adventure with God. Sometimes things are going to be tough, they are going to be confusing, and yet God promises something beyond that, and we have the choice. Will I trust? Will I hope anyway?